listening to Stories from Real Life, a podcast by engaging storytellers for engaged story listeners. Here's your host, author and journalist, Melvin E. Edwards.
Hello again, and welcome to this July 30th edition of Stories from Real Life. I'm your host, Melvin E. Edwards. John Williams will tell us about today's guest, Sarah Armstrong.
It's time to change the conversation about divorce. And that's exactly what our guest today is trying to do. Sarah Armstrong is Vice President of Global Marketing Operations at Google, and she never expected to be in this situation. However, based on her personal experiences, she decided to write The Mom's Guide to a Good Divorce: What to Think Through When Children Are Involved. She defines a good divorce as one that puts the children first. For anyone wondering how they will ever come out the other side of a divorce and keep their family whole, Sarah is an inspiration. She offers practical tips and advice for moms and dads by sharing her inspiring personal stories and provides sage advice for taking practical steps to work toward the best outcome in the midst of the worst of circumstances. Please welcome corporate executive and author Sarah Armstrong on today's edition of Stories from Real Life with Melvin E. Edwards.
Thank you, John. Sarah Armstrong, welcome to the show.
Great to be with you, Melvin. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for being here. So before we begin with this topic, I think it's important for me to establish with my audience that even though I am divorced and remarried, I'm not an advocate for divorce. And both my guests and I want people who get married to remain married happily ever after. However, and unfortunately, things don't always work out that way. And this show is about making the best when the worst happens to you.
Yeah, absolutely, Melvin. I want to kind of echo that because I'm also not an advocate for divorce. In an ideal world, couples that get married do, stay happily married for the long term, right? And unfortunately, though, that's not always the case. And these days, it's more common than ever. And so one of the things that I like to reflect on is, no one gets married to get divorced. Right? No one gets divorced for positive reasons. Unfortunately, there's usually some type of trigger that has made you decide to go down that path. But when children are involved, children do not get to make the decision that their parents are going to get divorced. But their lives are the most significantly impacted by the decision. And so the reason I feel so passionate about the concept of having a good divorce is when you do go down that path, I think there's a way to do it so that your children aren't collateral damage in the process.
That's a good place to start. So your book is called The Mom's Guide to a Good Divorce. Is there really such a thing as a good divorce?
I do believe there is. And I think I get that question often. And, I first think there's not enough conversation around the topic of how to have a good divorce. And I think society has such a negative connotation about the bitter divorces that we generally have seen, that the concept of a good divorce seems like such an unattainable outcome, but I do think it's attainable. And, one of the reasons I feel that way is, a good divorce at the end of the day is when a couple puts aside their personal feelings for one another and they actually focus on what's best for their children. And I'd like to believe that in most of the instances, now sometimes, Melvin, what we'll talk about today, sometimes there are reasons that people cannot interact with each other and, and due to physical abuse and other things. And in that instance, I understand that that's a subset that may not be able to follow all that we're talking about today and apply some of the topics or the guidance. But, when a couple goes through divorce and children involved, the stakes are high. And, we owe it to our children to ensure that they're not that collateral damage. And even though we've decided to no longer be married to each other, and not live in the same house, we made a commitment when we brought our children into the world to raise them in the healthiest, happiest, safest environment possible. And I joke that, you cover the plugs and you put bike helmets on them, and you feed them organic milk. You do all these things because you want them to be these healthy, right? These healthy kids. But then from a divorce, in a divorce situation, there's toxicity that can come from a divorce process. And that can have long-term impact on children's approach to relationships, their views on marriage, and their overall happiness in life. And I think it takes a couple taking co-parenting seriously with the intent of having a good divorce. And so that's really, so to answer your question, it's a long-winded way of answering it, but I do think a good divorce is something that's an attainable outcome, but it takes very specific mindsets and actions to actually achieve that.
Okay. So your book is specifically written for women, for moms. What advice or suggestions would you have for men in a divorce situation?
Well, the divorce, you're right. My book is called The Mom's Guide to a Good Divorce, and it is focused on moms because I wrote it as if I was talking to my girlfriends that are going through divorce. But a lot of the guidance and the majority of the guidance could be applicable to men. And I think that the advice I give for both men or women going through divorce is it starts with your mindset. And I think the one thing we can all control is our mindset. We can't control someone else's mindset. We can control our mindset. And I think if you go into a divorce situation saying, look, I know we have to get through this. This is a challenging process. But at the end of the day, I want us to be able to co-parent our children or our child in the best possible way. That alone, that statement can set you on a course of heading in the right direction versus the statement of, well, I'm wanting to take that person down or, have the negative mindset that you can go into this. I mean, again, it's not an easy thing to divide up life and all that comes with it. But I do think if you go in with that mindset, that's the most fundamental thing that I think both men and women could do that could put you on the right path.
Okay. So what advice would you have for people who aren't themselves going through a divorce, but have a close friend or relative who is?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think one of the things is the support that people need when they're going through divorce is wide ranging. Sometimes they just need someone to listen. Sometimes they need someone to maybe, call out if they're seeing that negativity and say, hey, let's think about, your kid, help them, guide them back on the path of getting to a more positive mindset of what they need to do. And so, it is a matter of being there for your friends or your family members that might be going through this. And I actually have had a lot of friends that have read my book with that intent. Like, I'm not going through divorce and I'm very happily married, but I want to be able to support my friends through this. And I want to understand what are all the things that are coming at them as they, go through this process. And so it's interesting that you can look at it from that lens as well.
Okay. So what's an important lesson that you learned during your personal divorce process?
Yeah, I mean, so many, so many, but I think one of the moments for me that was so poignant, first I should explain, my daughter was 7 when we got divorced, and she there's one moment I want to share with you because it frames why I believe in the concept of good divorce. She and I were at a CVS checking out at a year after our divorce, and there was a People magazine on the cover, and it had a celebrity couple getting divorced. And she looks and she goes, Mommy, is that a good divorce or a bad divorce? And I said, Grace, I don't know. What's the difference between a good divorce and a bad divorce? She goes, well, good divorce is when the mommy and daddy are nice to each other like you and daddy, and a bad divorce is when they scream and yell at each other. And I thought, wow. I said, wow. Exactly, Melvin, literally. And I thought, wow. And so I said, Grace, well, it's hard to tell from the magazine cover what kind of divorce that is. But as I walked into that CVS that day, Melvin, I thought, whatever my ex-husband and I were doing, the fact that our daughter at age 8, a year after we had literally changed her life so significantly, could say that we had a good divorce, I knew that we were on to something. So that was my first big, major learning. The second one that was a really poignant moment was we had decided prior to telling Grace that we were going to have her see a child specialist, like a therapist, once we told her. And we went to meet with him. My ex-husband and I went to meet with him before we told Grace. And he looked at me and he said, do you travel? And I said, yeah, I travel internationally for my job. And he looks at my ex-husband. He says, do you travel? And he said, yeah, I travel domestically. He said, well, Grace is about to become a professional traveler. She's going to travel every week for the next 11 years until she goes off to college. Wow. And I burst into tears, Mom. And I thought, that's not what I want for her. That's not the life I want her to live. And so we walked out of that session, and I looked at my ex-husband. I said, I don't know what this looks like, but I want to minimize Grace feeling like she's a professional traveler. And so now what I'm going to say now does have some socioeconomic considerations, and I want to acknowledge that. But what we tried to do was to put all the basics at both homes. So when I say the basics, socks, underwear, the pajamas, all those things, so that when Grace, in first grade is walking out the door to go to school, all she has to carry is her backpack. She doesn't have to carry the extra bag because she's going to mom or dad's house after school and being the only kid in the carpool line with an extra bag and being asked, like, why do you have that bag? Well, because I have to go to my dad's house tonight, or I have to go to my mom's house tonight. So we tried to minimize. Now, there are special items that you're not going to have two of, but where we could, we tried to have the basics. Now, I do joke in a lighthearted way, Melvin, that there were times when we would get out of balance. And I don't know how it happened, but all the socks or whatever would end up at one house, and we'd have rebalancing days where it's like, let's figure out. But by the way, it wasn't up for Grace at age 7, 8, 9 to figure out why her things weren't where they were supposed to be. That was up to us. So I would just text my ex-husband and say, hey, I don't have these items. Can you go in Grace's drawers? And and then he would put them in a bag, and then he'd hand them to me, and I'd put them back in her drawers at my place. Again, she shouldn't have to unpack and repack her life every week because things are, not where they should be. So I think it's an important, for me, it was a learning that the professional traveler mindset and what that meant was something that really hit me. And then it was, how did we actually take that and try to minimize that impact on Grace, in her day to day.
Okay. And speaking of traveling and not wanting Grace to be a professional traveler, I understand that you and your ex-husband made an agreement that you wouldn't move away from the Atlanta area until she had graduated from high school. So did that affect your career at all, either of your careers at all?
Oh, it's a great question. No, I think we were fortunate. We both were able to continue to invest in our career in a meaningful way and be in Atlanta. And so I don't think it limited either of our career potential or growth. But it was a conscious decision we made to stay in Atlanta until she graduated. And then in fairness, we both have, since Grace graduated, she's now 21, which is crazy. We're off, she's in college. But when she headed up to college, we both sold our respective homes and left Atlanta. But we did stay there, and that was a very conscious decision to stay there, to co-parent her in the same community and be able to be there, as her parents in those moments, and I think that was important to us. And some families don't have that ability to do that because a parent has to move for a job and they may have to have further distance between them. But for us, that was something we really tried to do. And we did make that commitment to stay in the same city. And we were within 10 minutes of each other. So it made it easy for, drop offs. And speaking of those like special items, one day Grace came down and she was, Mom, it's dress up day at school. And then my dress up shoes are at Dad's house. And I said, well, and of course we're dressed up. I'm cutting it very thin, Melvin, to get out the door on time. I said, well, let's go to Dad's house and get your dress up shoes. So that allowed us to, in those moments, to be able to go back and forth as needed. So that was, again, conscious decision that we made within our situation.
Yeah, I can understand that situation perfectly because I faced something similar. I'm in Texas now, which is my home state. But at the time I got divorced, I was living in Maryland, and we moved to Maryland because that's where my ex-wife wanted to live. And I didn't necessarily want to be there. So, but when we started the process of getting divorced, our youngest was 3 years old. And I made the decision that I would stay there until she graduated from high school. So I ended up being there and another 15 years. That's a sacrifice, but it was worth it because it was for her. It was for my child.
Absolutely. And to be there, Melvin, and to be able to go to the school play or the soccer game or basketball game, to be there and actively part of your child's life, I think is so important. And you're right. It can be seen as the sacrifice, but I think the the impact that has on our children's lives to have both parents present and part of their lives in this way is so important. So I think that is well worth it. And I think we felt the same way. There was probably, both of us probably would have chosen to live in other places sooner, but we felt that that's where we needed to live.
Yeah, easily the greatest accomplishment for me, if somebody asks me, what are you the most proud of in your life? And it's not going to be a professional accomplishment. It's that I never missed one of my kids' events. If sporting event, choir event, parent-teacher conference, I went to every single one, and that's what I'm the most proud of.
You know what? I'm right with you. And I think that that's something that when you do prioritize those moments and you can be there, I think that's, that shows so much both commitment to your children, but also it's so fulfilling to know that you were there for those moments. It's interesting. One of the other points along our journey that really stuck out for me, speaking of parent-teacher conferences, is when Grace was in 6th grade. We'd been divorced for 5 years at that point, but in her school, both parents go to the parent-teacher conference, and the child actually attends as well. And so we go in and we sit down and talk to our teacher for about an hour. And at the end of it, the teacher looks at us and goes, "Wait a minute, are you two divorced?" And I said, "Oh yeah, we've been divorced for 5 years." She goes, "I had no idea." And I said to her, "Well, it didn't occur to me to come in and start the conference with, 'Hi, we're divorced. Can we now talk about Grace's education?'" I said, I don't know where the relevance of that is. And what was interesting is that she said to me, "You would be surprised at how few parents that are divorced can come into this office and sit down with their child for 1 hour and talk about their child's education." She said, "It is very, very rare." And she goes, "And it really makes me sad." And I said to her, "That makes me really sad too, because what's more important to two parents than how their child is doing in school, and wanting to hear about that." And by the way, Grace is hearing this whole thing. And so I just walked away from that and thought, that's one of those things, an action we can take as divorced parents to say, no, I'm going to show up with my ex-spouse and sit down, and we should be able to set aside whatever, again, except for those extenuating circumstances I mentioned earlier, all of the divorce situations, I think you should be able to sit down next to that ex-spouse for that hour to talk about your child's education.
I agree completely. So this question is one that you may not have gotten much, I'm guessing. We'll see. So you're the head of international marketing at Google. So I'm assuming you do a lot of travel internationally.
Yes.
Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
So what attitudes have you seen in other countries regarding divorce and remarriage?
It's a great question. And just to clarify, I head up the global marketing operations for Google, not international marketing per se, but that's a very specific part. Just want to clarify that. But in terms of attitudes, it's really interesting. Early on, about a couple of years after my divorce, I was in Mexico City. And I was at a dinner with a group of Latin colleagues, and a good friend and colleague of mine turned to me and he said, "Sarah, you're so happy." And I was like, "Yeah, I'm really happy." He said, "But you're divorced." And I said, "Solomon, getting divorced is not a death sentence." I said, "I'm happy." I said, "My ex-husband's happy." I go, "Grace is happy." I go, "We're all happy. And yes, we did go through a divorce." And the interesting thing about that conversation is I had mentioned to him that many of my friends had been encouraging me to write down my guidance that I'd been sharing with them after the divorce, those that had come to ask for some help as they were thinking through their own situations. And they've been encouraging me to write a book. And I said, "Oh, well, I don't know that I'll ever do that." So at that dinner, he said to me, you should really write that book." And so the next morning, I got on that flight out of Mexico City and I opened my personal laptop and I started writing. And that's how this whole journey of The Mom's Guide to a Good Divorce started. So I wrote the first line that said, "This book has been written by a girl who never ever thought she would get a divorce, who got a divorce, and what she learned along the way." And so it was just a trigger. But that moment, and to your point, that moment of like a cultural perspective from a Latin male, in fairness, kind of triggered all of this. But I thought it was really interesting for him to connect the fact that I was happy and that was strange because I was divorced. And I do think it's a societal perception that when you get divorced, and this is what I don't understand, Melvin, but it's that you're supposed to have this negative cloud that follows you throughout your life. I just don't think that has to be the case. And the reason we get divorced is to go to happier, to a happier place, to figure out how to be happy in a different way. And I really feel it's interesting that that perception of, because you've gone through this, divorce is an action, right? You get divorced. It does not need to be a negative cloud or a scarlet letter, quite honestly, that you carry around with you because you have gone through that specific action.
Okay. And after you do get divorced, at some point, just about everybody starts to date again and form new relationships. Yes. So what do you think is the best time to introduce the children to someone new in your life in a romantic situation?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think that's it really depends on the situation. It depends on the age of your children. It depends on how you see that relationship being a part of your day-to-day life. But I do think my only advice that I generally give is to just really be thoughtful about when and how you do that, and ensure that it's enough of a serious relationship that person is going to be around versus having lots of people come in and out of your children's lives post-divorce, because I think that can be confusing, especially depending on the age of the child. So I do think it's very up to the specific situation, but just really being thoughtful about when and how you do that, and realizing that your kids want you to be happy. And I think that generally, they understand that you're going to end up being with someone else at some point down the road. But it's just a matter of really being thoughtful about when and how you introduce them.
Okay. And once again, on the topic of co-parenting, what types of tips would you recommend for people who are newly in this situation?
Yeah, there's so much to share there. I think that a couple of things. One, the communication between parents is so important, and figuring out how and when you want to communicate with your ex-spouse on details. Like I used to keep a list. Again, the beauty of email and texting these days is you can be in constant communication if you want to be, or you can, put together a list and then in a moment say, okay, I'm going to run through these things with you. And so I think, again, it depends on what your relationship is with your ex-spouse in terms of which approach you want to take from a communication standpoint. I think the other thing, and I mentioned earlier about showing up for your children as their parents in those moments. And, you talked in an amazing way about being at all of your kids' events. I think that as parents, like if you show up at an event for your child, if you can at least, ideally you're standing near each other or sitting near each other, because the kids that, have a wonderful moment, say they, score a goal or whatever, if they have to look at one side of the field and then the other side of the field, because God forbid their parents stand on the same side of the field with each other, like that just is a reinforcing moment for the child versus being able to look to one side and ideally to one area and see mom and dad smiling and clapping for them, And so those are these moments as parents, if we could just take out the feelings we have for the other person and just insert what's the impact on our kids right now and our children in these moments. I think that's one of the most important things from almost a co-parenting principle. And then the other thing is, as much as you can try to stay on the same page with the other co-parent, and again, sometimes you're obviously going to have differences of opinion, but on the important topics and when you're trying to work through topics together, comparing notes and hopefully having a unified view of certain things can help. Sometimes that's easier said than done, but I think that can help as well. So, there's a range of things that we can do, but I do think that showing up for your kids, and being there, communicating clearly. And then I will say I talk about taking the high road in my book. And, sometimes it can be tough to take the high road. The high road's very steep. But I think in co-parenting moments when you're thinking you want to, make a comment or, not do something because it feels like you're giving that person, a point on their, side of the scorecard if you're keeping score. It's like, try to get rid of that mindset and just say, what's best for my kids? And then take the high road and just go that route. I've never regretted taking the high road. And I think it's just one of those things to think about.
And along those same lines, one of the least talked about parts of a divorce is managing life events years after the divorce has been finalized, including dealing with former in-laws. So how would you manage things like graduations, weddings, births, things like that? I know some of those situations you haven't yet faced.
Yes, yeah. Well, yeah, I haven't faced the births and the weddings yet, but we've done graduations and birthdays and all those things. So, my belief again is that your child deserves to have whoever is in their life from a family standpoint there to celebrate those special moments. And so, my ex-husband and my parents and I celebrated her graduation. Sadly, his parents had passed and weren't able to be there. But I think that that's part of, again, setting aside feelings for each other and being there in the moment. And so I do think that as much as you can do that, it allows the full family to celebrate your child in the way that they deserve to be celebrated. And it can be, again, there can be feelings during those times, but I really think compartmentalizing those feelings a bit, if you can, and really focusing on the special moment for your child is going to be the most important thing. And I do talk about in the book building a compartmentalization muscle, which, Melvin, I think many of us could use in lots of aspects of our life. But I think specifically in going through a divorce and in the post-divorce era. And I joke that I do Pilates, so they talk about a strong core muscle. But this is about, when you have emotions for that ex-spouse, do you need them to come out and be shown in that moment when maybe your buttons are being pushed? Or do you say, you know what, I'm not going to react right now. I'm just going to let that pass. I'm going to get through this moment. And I think the more we can do that, the more it allows, again, our children to not be dragged into all of those moments that pull us back into the fact that, yes, we're divorced, these things happened. And by the way, I'm not saying to suppress those emotions completely. I'm just saying to maybe not react in that moment and, later on talk to your friends or a family member or a therapist or go for a long walk and talk to yourself, whatever the case may be. But I think it is important to set aside the ability to react in that moment because your children can't necessarily handle all the emotions that you may want to express. Because they, depending on the age and also their understanding of the situation, they're going to take that on, and it's stuff that they probably shouldn't have to take on.
Okay. So one of the things you talked about in your book was the symbolism of jewelry. Can you tell the audience what you did with your old engagement ring?
Yeah. So when I was getting a divorce, I decided that I had a beautiful ring that had been my engagement ring. And I thought, well, it still is a special piece, but I think I want to repurpose it. So I actually had it made into a necklace, and I still wear it to this day. And I'd like to pass it on to Grace, but from a different form that she'll have down the road. And I thought that was important. And then I also decided to, in taking off both rings, that you do, which is obviously symbolic of no longer being married. I designed a ring that I wore on my other ring finger, my right hand, that was just almost a gift to myself of starting a new phase of life. And so those are the two things that I kind of did as part of my divorce journey. And it's funny, I get many compliments on my necklace when I'm out and about, and I always say it's my engagement ring that I repurposed as a necklace post-divorce. And people are like, that's a great idea. So anyways, I found it, it's still special. And honestly, I think I was meant to marry my ex-husband, to have Grace and to live the life we did for a point. And then it wasn't meant to be for the long term, and that's okay. We're all happy in our next phases of life.
Okay. So the next thing I want to talk about is for somebody who's about to go through the situation. So what are some things they should be aware of the first year of the divorce? And one thing I want to add before you start answering the question is, one of the things I realize and notice is divorce in a lot of ways is like death. And it's the death of a situation, death of a dream. And you go through the cycles, you go through first birthdays and Christmas and all those things. What would you say to somebody who's about to go through that situation?
Yeah, no, it's a great point. So I do talk in the book about preparing for your firsts, and exactly what you said. You're going to go through all of those first moments. And when you go through them, I think the important thing to think about is, are there traditions that you want to try to continue, as a in a different structure and in a different way. And if you go through that and you try it and it works out well, great. But if you go through it and you're like, what, that did not feel good, I did not enjoy that, my kids didn't enjoy it, then don't do it the second year. This is a year of learning. You're going to try new things. You're going to hopefully continue some traditions, start some new traditions, but just really reflect after all of those moments, the birthdays, the first vacation, the first holiday, and see how it feels, and have an open conversation both with yourself and then with your kids of how did that go, and do you want to continue to do that next year? And I do say that for that first year you're recovering from a divorce hangover, while still driving carpool everywhere. You're still having to live your day to day, but you're still trying to get through, and that first year it can be really hard. And the only other thing I'd reflect on is holidays, which I think are probably the hardest part, especially if you are either sharing holidays or flip-flopping, where you might have your kids one Christmas and not the other. I found that holidays were the hardest part. And even, over the years, that was the one thing I could never really get used to, is the holidays I didn't have Grace with me. And so for those holidays, I decided to change the structure of what Christmas or Thanksgiving looked like. And for the holidays I didn't have her, instead of spending them with my family and my nieces and nephews without Grace there, I decided to travel and to just kind of change the tradition for me in those moments, because I felt like it was an important thing to do. And that, again, was just how I handled it. But I think it's just a matter of being really reflective of how that year first goes, and then deciding how you want to approach the next one.
Okay. And so how do you prioritize self-care, which sounds like is how you handled the holidays?
Yeah, no, I think self-care is so important. And by the way, as parents, we are trying to juggle a lot. And one of the things that I think is important is to really think about what is it you need to be healthy and happy for yourself, and whether it's getting a workout in, or getting a weekly massage, or getting the right amount of sleep, or traveling, whatever it is that fills your soul and your energy, to keep on with the juggling act of being a parent and all that comes with that. I think that's really important. And so, I personally am very committed to the wellness side of my life, and making sure they, eat well, work out, getting enough sleep is my biggest challenge, because I like to pack a lot into the day. But in general, I think it is very important to, especially during a divorce, to really think about what you need to stay healthy, because it is a very intense time in life. It's a very emotional time in life. And so your physical, mental, and emotional health at that time is something that can sometimes be set aside because you're worrying about everything else. But you really need to try to invest in that as well, because you need that strength for the long term.
Well, as a man, one of the things I found and was really discouraged by at the time of my divorce, which was about 20 years ago, was how heavily weighted the system was for the moms in the custody situations. So assuming both parents are safe and have safe environments, do you think the custody should always be 50-50? Is there some type of work combination that works for the kids?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. We had 50-50, so we had joint custody in our situation, and I think it worked really well, and it worked for us. I think in an ideal world, yes, 50-50 would be great. There are some instances, though, where one parent or the other may not be able to manage the 50-50 in a way, whether they travel a lot or whatever the case may be, and it may be harder. But I think where it can be, I think that could be seen as an ideal, and we did it, and I think it really worked well for us. But it goes a bit back to the situational, what the dynamics of both parents are, and the availability of really being present. Because if a parent wants 50-50, but then is traveling a ton, and the child ends up being by themselves or with a nanny or something versus being with the other parent, I also don't know that that's, ideal. And so in our situation, because we both traveled, we always had what we called first right of refusal. So if one of us was traveling and Grace was supposed to be with us during that traveling time, we always asked the other parent, would you rather have her? And so there were weeks where my ex-husband might have her for the full week because I was on a trip, and that was fine. And it wasn't a situation, that one where I was quote unquote keeping score and saying, well, you've had her this week, so now I need to make up those days. Like, that's not, it's just like, you know what, I was out of town. Thank you for having her. And obviously as her dad, he was happy to. But I think those are things where sometimes people try to keep score on like the number of days, and you can do that. But I think things do kind of work out over the course of time, and it's better just to kind of roll with things as much as you can.
Okay. So tell us about the Mother's Day card that you received from your ex-husband.
Oh, great question. So at the end of my book, actually, the very last page of my book, I share a Mother's Day card that my ex-husband gave me about 5 years after our divorce. And ultimately what it said is it really... it recognized that he appreciated the approach we took to co-parenting and the type of mom I've been to Grace, and just thanked me, basically. And it was a very special card and very special moment because it was just a recognition of we'd, gone through a lot, but at kind of 5 years post-divorce, to get those sentiments shared with me in a card from ex-husband was a special moment, and I do appreciate him sharing those thoughts. And I quite honestly would say the same thing back to him. I think we both really took seriously that co-parenting Grace was our top priority. And I think we both showed up the way that we needed to over the course of her life, all the way up to moving her into her college dorm room together when she headed off to college. We both took her to college and moved her into the dorm room. And we actually went out to dinner that night to celebrate and say we've launched her into the world. So that was fun to do. And so I think that those are, the moments where, again, we've chosen no longer to be married to each other, but we're still Grace's parents. And we can celebrate those moments, I think, in a way to reflect on what we've been able to do together.
That's pretty incredible. And did you, the night that you took her off and left her at the dorm, I'm sure there were lots of tears shed. Did you just feel a sense of pride that the two of you were able to put aside everything else for a common goal, and you were successful in doing that?
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I think, and the fun thing, I will say, there weren't tears actually for any of us, because we were so excited for Grace to be heading off into this phase. It was a lot of pride. And we invited Grace to dinner. She wanted to go out with her new friends that she made at her dorm and her new roommate. And we said, you absolutely should go do that. So it was a lot of pride. It was a lot of, reflecting back and saying, we've done this. And it wasn't always easy. And by the way, I'm not, there are definitely bumps in the road, that it is not a smooth road, but it's how you handle those speed bumps that I think is important. And I can say that I'm proud of how my ex-husband and I have handled the journey that we've gone on to raise Grace together, and that we could get to that moment where we moved her in and then went and had a moment to reflect.
That's pretty amazing. So I just have a couple questions left.
Yeah.
So what's the best reader feedback you've gotten regarding your book?
Oh gosh, I've had two moments actually that have stick out for me. One was I was right after I launched my book, a couple weeks after, I was at a grocery store in the produce section, and this woman walked up to me and she said, "Are you Sarah Armstrong, the author?" And I had to stop. And this was early on in Melbourne, and I was like, "Oh gosh, yeah,
I'm an author."
Surprised! I hadn't really thought about myself that way. So I said, "Yes." I said, and she goes, "Well, I was at your book signing at Barnes & Noble." And she said, "And I'm going through a divorce." And I said, "Oh, I'm so sorry to hear you're going through a divorce." She said, "Well, I want you to know that I carry your book with me everywhere, and it keeps me calm." And she said, "Thank you for writing it." And I said, "Well, thank you for sharing that with me." And so she walked away, Melvin, and here I'm standing in the produce section with my cart. And I looked at her and I thought to myself, that's exactly why I've written this book, is to help a woman that I've never met before, who's going through one of the most difficult times that you can go through as a parent or as a mom. And if my book is helping to keep her calm as she goes through that, then that alone was worth all the effort it went into in terms of putting all the details into a book and getting it published. And then the second story, which also struck me from a different angle, is I had a young gal who was networking with me from the business standpoint. Excuse me. And as we got on the call, she said, "I want to tell you that I'm reading your book." And I said, "Oh gosh, as I mentioned earlier, it's a very bittersweet thing for me to hear that someone needs my book. I mean, I'm happy that it's there to help people, and she said, well, I sent it to my friend's house and I sit in her driveway in my car and I read it because I can't have it at home. And she said, but thank you for writing it because it's so important and I make the time to go sit in my car in her driveway to read it. And so that just struck me of like the fact that, people are looking for guidance and that's the steps she needed to take. And then the final and third reflection I recently received was from a divorce attorney who I did a podcast with. And she did share with me, she said, Sarah, I've read probably 50 divorce books out there. And she said, yours is the best that I've read, and specifically in terms of the practical guidance that it gives and these bite-sized pieces that people can take in. And she said, I'm just hoping that every couple that's going through a divorce could read your book because I really think it would help them as they're going down this path. So that was just a bit of feedback that really I appreciated because I do think my book is really just, I do this to give back, Melvin. I have a career that's not related to writing books and the topic of divorce, but I really do this just to give back and help men and women that are going through this in a way that hopefully helps them understand how a good divorce can be possible.
Okay. And I appreciate you writing the book too. It didn't come along soon enough for me, and I'm not the target reader, but still just reading it's reinforced some of the things that I think I may have gotten right and reflect on some things that I clearly got wrong. And I can pass along the books to some other people who are newly in that process. Hopefully not too many people, but
yeah, I was about to say, I always say I'm always sorry when someone says I gave my friend your book, and I always go, oh good, I'm sorry. It's a bittersweet thing, but thank you.
Yes. All right. So finally here, can you tell the readers, or can you tell the listeners where they can get your book and how they can maybe contact you or follow you on social media?
Absolutely, yes. So if you go to www.gooddivorce.guide is my website, and that's where you can contact me and learn more about the book. The book is available on Amazon, on Barnes & Noble, and various booksellers around the world. And it's available in paperback, ebook, iBook, Kindle book, all of the various ebook formats, as well as I did go into the studio and do an Audible version. So if someone would rather go on a walk and listen to some of the guidance, I should explain, Melvin, that the book is broken down into 3 phases: preparing for the change, during the change, and post the change. And it has 185 bite-sized pieces of topics for people to read. And it's not meant to be read cover to cover. It depends on where you are in your process. And the table of contents outlines every topic. So you can just go in and look for that topic and read that one topic and maybe reflect on that topic or 2 that you want to take in, and then go back to it when you need it. So that's how it's been, designed and structured. And I have gotten a lot of feedback actually on the design of the book as well, that when you're going through a divorce, there's so much coming at you, and it is meant to help you along the way when you need it.
Okay. Well, our guest this week has been corporate executive and author Sarah Armstrong. Sarah, thank you so much for being here today and sharing your stories. It's been a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you so much, Melvin, for having me here. I really enjoyed going with you, and I hope your listeners, those that might need the help from this book, can look into and think within themselves of whether they can go down the path of striving to have a good divorce, because I do think it's an attainable outcome. So thank you so much.
All right. Thank you. So that's it for this week's episode of Stories from Real Life. Join us again next time for another great storytelling journey. Until then, don't forget to shine your light wherever you go.
That was Stories from Real Life. Join us again next week for another great storytelling journey. See you next time.